There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the plain clothes of a Tuesday afternoon or the borrowed formality of a friend's wedding reception. You don't recognize them as thresholds until long after you've crossed them. For me, that moment smelled of hotel air conditioning, cheap champagne, and the specific, clean scent of Julian's shampoo. He was asleep, his head a heavy, trusting weight on my shoulder, his breathing a slow and steady tide against my collarbone. The muffled beat of the wedding reception pulsed through the floorboards from 2 stories below, a distant drumbeat for a world we had temporarily left behind. In the dim light of our shared room, with the city of Denver glowing through a gap in the curtains, I sat perfectly still, a statue carved from equal parts terror and reverence. I had not been this close to him in 5 years, and every dormant nerve ending in my body was suddenly, painfully, awake. This, I knew even then, was not an ordinary moment. It was the quiet beginning of a tectonic shift, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of a friendship I had long ago encased in the amber of memory. To understand the weight of his head on my shoulder, you would have to understand the architecture of the space I had built between us. Julian and I met in college, a pairing so archetypally mismatched it felt like the invention of a lazy screenwriter. He was the sun, I was the satellite caught in its orbit. He was the captain of the swim team, a broad-shouldered physics major who moved through the world with an unthinking grace, collecting friends and accolades like his hair collected droplets of chlorine. I was a photography student, most comfortable in the quiet solitude of the darkroom, watching images slowly bloom into existence in the chemical bath. We were assigned as roommates our sophomore year, a fluke of the university's housing algorithm that would become the central, defining axis of my early 20s. Our room was a study in contrasts. His side was a controlled explosion of textbooks, damp towels, and team sweatshirts. Mine was meticulously ordered, my cameras and lenses arranged on their shelves like holy relics, prints of stark landscapes, and intimate portraits pinned to the wall. He filled the space with sound, with laughter, with the bass line of whatever music he was currently obsessed with the endless parade of teammates who treated our door like a revolving one. I filled it with silence, a quiet observer cataloging the light as it shifted across the floorboards, cataloging the cadence of his voice as he argued with his then-girlfriend on the phone, cataloging the way he'd fall into bed after a grueling practice, asleep before his head even fully hit the pillow. He was beautiful, in a way that seemed both effortless and utterly unfair. It wasn't just the classical athlete's build or the bright, easy smile. It was in the details. The way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck when it grew too long. The sprinkle of freckles across his nose that only appeared in the height of summer. The focused, almost severe intensity in his eyes when he was working through a complex physics problem, a stark contrast to his usual laid-back demeanor. I, with my camera, was a student of details, and I studied him relentlessly. I have dozens of photographs from that time, undeveloped negatives stored in a box in my closet, that are just of him. Julian sleeping, his face softened and vulnerable. Julian laughing, his head thrown back, a blur of pure joy. Julian standing by the window, backlit by the dawn, unaware of my gaze. I never showed them to anyone. They were not for art, they were for me. They were a secret language, a confession I could only make to myself. My affection for him was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of our friendship. It was a room I kept locked within myself, the key long since thrown away. I knew the landscape of that affection was a barren one. Julian was a creature of friendly, physical affection with everyone, and he moved through a world of pretty, smiling girlfriends. He would sling an arm around my shoulders as we walked to class, or knock his knee against mine under the table in the dining hall, and for him, it meant nothing more than the gesture itself. For me, each touch was a spark that I had to meticulously extinguish before it could catch fire. I became an expert in emotional self-preservation, in translating the language of his casual intimacy into something platonic and safe. It was the only way to keep him. The friendship was a masterpiece of architecture, built on the foundation of my silence. To speak would have been to take a sledgehammer to the whole thing, and the thought of the rubble, of the empty space where he used to be, was more than I could bear. Our friendship was deep, but it was a friendship of unspoken understanding rather than overt confession. We didn't have long, soul-bearing conversations about our fears or our dreams. Instead, our closeness was built in the shared quiet of late-night study sessions, in the way he would bring me a coffee from the campus cafe without asking, knowing I'd been in the darkroom for hours. It was in the way I knew to leave a clean towel on his bed on meet days, and the way he learned to move quietly around the room when he saw I was in the delicate process of editing my prints. We orbited each other, two celestial bodies held in a stable, predictable pattern by the gravity of mutual respect and a quiet, comfortable companionship. I loved him, and because I loved him, I learned to be content with my place in his sky, a distant moon reflecting his light. I never asked for more. I never imagined more was possible. After graduation, life did what life does. It pulled us apart. He took a high-powered consulting job in Chicago, a city of steel and wind that seemed a world away from the sun-drenched pools of his college days. I moved to Denver, drawn by the sharp, clear light and the stark beauty of the mountains, and began the slow, arduous process of building a career as a freelance photographer. Our communication dwindled, as it so often does, from weekly calls to monthly texts, and then to the occasional holiday greeting or a like on a social media post. The distance was a mercy, in a way. It allowed the low hum of my affection to fade into something almost inaudible. The locked room inside me grew dusty, the memory of what it held becoming softer, less defined. I built a life for myself. I had friends. I dated occasionally. I found a rhythm in my work. The intense, aching focus of my love for Julian became just another photograph from a bygone era, a portrait of a younger self I no longer quite recognized. I told myself I had moved on. I told myself the foundation of our friendship was now just a ruin, beautiful in its own way, but firmly in the past. I almost believed it. Then came the wedding invitation. It was for our mutual friends, Mark and Sarah, a couple who had been the steadfast core of our college social circle. The ceremony was in Denver, a convenient fact that left me with no excuse not to attend. A text from Julian followed shortly after. "You going to Mark's wedding? They're putting me in a hotel. Guessing you are too." My heart did a slow, painful lurch. I texted back a confirmation, my fingers feeling clumsy and foreign on the screen of my phone. He replied almost immediately. "Awesome. I requested we room together. Save us some money. Can't wait to see you." Man, just like that, 5 years of carefully constructed distance collapsed. The thought of sharing a room with him felt both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff I had long ago sworn never to approach again. The dust began to stir in that locked room inside me. A faint light flickered under the door. The wedding itself was a blur of polite conversation and forced smiles. I moved through the crowds of familiar faces, feeling like a ghost haunting my own past. Everyone had changed, settling into the shapes of their adult lives. They had mortgages, promotions, babies on the way. They spoke a language of practicality and future plans that I felt I had yet to master. I felt a profound sense of dislocation, of being an observer rather than a participant, my camera a welcome shield between me and the world. I took photos of the bride and groom, of laughing guests, of the flower girl dropping petals on the runner. I was framing life, but I was not in the frame. And then I saw him. He was standing across the reception hall, talking to a group of his old teammates. He looked different, yet exactly the same. The consulting world had sharpened his edges, trading the relaxed softness of his college years for a well-tailored suit and a more guarded posture. But the smile was the same when it finally broke through, and the way he ran a hand through his hair when he was listening intently had not changed at all. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and for a split second, the noise and the people faded away. It was just him and me, suspended in a moment of recognition that felt deeper than just a simple greeting. He gave me a small, almost tired smile and a nod, a silent promise of a conversation to come. The hum inside me, the one I thought had gone silent, returned. It It was no longer a hum. It was a clear, resonant chord. The shift began subtly, a change in atmospheric pressure before the storm. When we finally broke away from the crowd and found a quiet corner near the bar, the easy camaraderie I remembered was still there, but it was overlaid with something else, something I couldn't quite name. A weariness. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes thinner than I remembered. He talked about his job, the endless travel, the high-stakes presentations, but the usual enthusiasm was gone, replaced by a kind of rote recitation. He described his life in Chicago as a series of obligations, a checklist he was methodically working his way through. He told me about his breakup. It was with a woman named Claire, someone he'd been with for almost 3 years. I had seen her in photos on his social media, a beautiful, polished lawyer who looked like she had been designed to stand next to him in a corporate holiday card. He spoke of the end of their relationship not with the sharp pain of heartbreak, but with a kind of exhausted resignation. It just ran its course, he said, swirling the ice in his whiskey. We were on different tracks. She wanted to talk about buying a condo, and I just couldn't. It felt like I was trying to put on a suit that was 2 sizes too small. I couldn't breathe. He looked at me then, his gaze direct and searching, as if he was looking for an answer I couldn't possibly have. Does that make any sense? It makes perfect sense, I said, and I meant it. I knew what it felt like to be trying to fit into a shape that wasn't your own. He seemed to deflate with relief, the tension leaving his shoulders. God, thank you. Everyone else just looks at me like I'm crazy for letting her go. He was quiet for a moment, staring into his glass. It's just lonely. The job is lonely. The city is lonely. I'm surrounded by people all day, but I feel like I haven't had a real conversation in months. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable. This was a Julian I had never seen before. The sun-drenched, confident boy from college had been replaced by a man adrift in a sea of his own making, looking for a lighthouse. And for some reason, he was looking at me. Later that night, back in the sterile quiet of our hotel room, the dynamic between us had fundamentally changed. The old, easy boundaries of our college friendship felt porous, ill-defined. He was no longer just Julian, my old roommate. He was Julian, the man who had just confessed a profound loneliness, who had looked at me with an unnerving mixture of desperation and trust. As we got ready for bed, the space felt charged with a new kind of intimacy. The simple act of brushing our teeth side by side at the double vanity felt freighted with unspoken meaning. I was hyper-aware of his proximity, of the scent of his skin, of the casual way he moved through the space that was, for this one night, ours. He had taken the bed closer to the window. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of a single bedside lamp. I got into my own bed, the sheets crisp and cool, and pretended to read a book on my phone. I could feel him shifting, settling. The silence stretched. It wasn't the comfortable silence of our college days. It was a silence filled with questions. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet in the darkness. "Hey, Leo." "Yeah," I said, my own voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Thanks. For listening anytime, man," I replied, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. Another long pause. "It's just good to see you," he said, and the words were imbued with a weight that felt far heavier than their simple meaning. It felt like he was saying, "It's good to be seen by you." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just said, "You too, Julian." I lay awake for a long time after he had fallen asleep, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. The city lights painted shifting patterns on the ceiling. I felt like I was standing on a precipice. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart were crumbling, and I was terrified of what might rush into the breach. The man sleeping a few feet away from me was not the boy I had so carefully loved from a distance. He was someone new, someone lost, and someone who, for reasons I could not comprehend, was turning to me for shelter. It was in that quiet, lonely hotel room that the ritual began, though neither of us would have called it that. After the wedding, we made a pact to not let another 5 years go by. It started with texts, which quickly escalated to phone calls. Real phone calls, the kind that lasted for hours, where we talked about everything and nothing. He told me more about the suffocating pressure of his job, the feeling that he was an actor playing the part of a successful young professional. I told him about my struggles and triumphs as a freelancer, about the elusive nature of light, about the patience required to capture a single, perfect moment. We were rebuilding the bridge between our two separate islands, plank by plank, conversation by conversation. The distance that had once been a source of safety for me now felt like an obstacle, an inconvenience. About a month after the wedding, he called me on a Thursday night. His voice was frayed at the edges, worn thin by exhaustion. "I have to be in LA for a client meeting on Monday," he said. I was thinking, what if I flew into Denver tomorrow night? Spend the weekend? I could just, I don't know, decompress. Before heading into the lion's den, the question was posed casually, but I could hear the need humming beneath it. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom with a well-worn couch. The logistics were an immediate, flashing warning sign. But the sound of his voice, the undisguised longing for a safe harbor, overrode all my carefully honed instincts for self-preservation. "Yeah," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Of course. My couch is famously uncomfortable, but it's yours, I don't care," he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. "I'd sleep on the floor. I just need a change of scenery." He arrived late Friday night, looking even more tired than he had at the wedding. He dropped his bag by the door, bypassed the couch entirely, and sank into my one comfortable armchair with a sigh that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. I handed him a beer, and we sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the city lights twinkling through my large living room window. He looked around my apartment, at the stacks of photography books, at the large, framed print of a solitary, ancient bristlecone pine hanging on the wall. "It's so quiet here," he said, more to himself than to me. I forgot what quiet sounded like that night. I set him up on the couch with pillows and a stack of blankets. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door behind me, but I couldn't sleep. The very knowledge of his presence in the next room was a physical thing, a pressure against the door, a warmth seeping through the walls. I could hear him shifting, turning, the soft sigh of the couch cushions. It was a strange and potent form of torment, being so close and yet so far. It was a replay of our college dorm room, but now the context was entirely different. We were not boys anymore. We were two men, each lonely in his own way, separated by a thin, flimsy door. The next day, we fell into an easy rhythm. We got coffee from my favorite neighborhood spot. We walked through a park. We talked. He seemed to shed the skin of his Chicago life with every passing hour. The guarded posture softened. The easy smile returned more frequently. He was becoming Julian again, the Julian I remembered, but with a new layer of vulnerability that made him seem more real, more accessible. That night, we ordered pizza and decided to watch a movie. My couch was not large. For us to both sit on it comfortably meant our shoulders would touch, our legs would be aligned side by side. I was acutely aware of every point of contact, a cartographer mapping a new and dangerous coastline. Halfway through the film, he shifted. He leaned his head back against the cushions and let out a soft sigh. Then, without a word, he tilted his head sideways, resting it gently on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. It was the same gesture from the hotel room, but this time, he was awake. Time seemed to slow down. I could feel the warmth of his cheek through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. I could feel the slight tickle of his hair against my neck. My mind raced, a frantic scramble to interpret the signal. Was this just Julian being Julian, the casually physical friend? Or was this something more? The plausible deniability was a shield for him, but it was a minefield for me. Every instinct screamed at me to pull away, to re-establish the safe distance. But I couldn't. The sheer, trusting weight of his head on my shoulder was an anchor, holding me in place. He smelled of soap and the cold night air, and something that was just intrinsically him. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. I focused on the movie, on the dialogue, on the soundtrack, on anything other than the man who was slowly, inexorably dismantling my defenses. After a few minutes, his breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Or so I thought. I risked a glance down. His eyes were closed, his face relaxed. He looked peaceful, younger. The weariness of the past few weeks seemed to have momentarily lifted. I sat there for the remainder of the film, and for a long time after the credits rolled, a living statue, my arm going numb, my heart a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I was terrified to move, terrified to break the spell. This simple act of trust felt more intimate than any kiss I had ever shared with anyone else. This became the ritual. Every few weeks, he would find a reason to come to Denver. A long weekend, a layover that somehow stretched for 2 days, a conveniently scheduled work trip. And every time, the weekend would culminate in this same scenario. We would be on the couch, watching a movie, or just talking, and he would lean against me. First his shoulder, then his head on my shoulder. Eventually, he would stretch out, laying his head in my lap, his long body taking up the length of the couch. He would always frame it with an excuse. "I'm so wrecked," he'd say. "Long week," or "Your couch is killing my back. Mind if I stretch out?" And I would always murmur my assent, my voice a low rumble of feigned nonchalance. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, transformed. It became a liminal space, a halfway house between friendship and something else. His presence lingered even when he was gone. A toothbrush in my bathroom holder. A sweatshirt left draped over the armchair. The faint indentation his head had left on my couch cushions. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the hope of what these gestures might mean and the terror of my own delusion. I was a photographer obsessed with a single subject, analyzing every frame, every shift in the light, searching for a truth that remained stubbornly out of focus. I began to think of my life in terms of developing a photograph. The friendship we had, the life I had built for myself, was a stable, fixed image. But his return, his new and confusing intimacy, had plunged that image back into the chemical bath. It was changing, the lines blurring, new shapes emerging from the shadows. I was in the darkroom, holding my breath, watching the transformation happen, knowing that the slightest miscalculation, too much time, too much agitation, a sudden exposure to light, could overdevelop the image, turning it into a black, unrecognizable mess. The process was agonizing. The waiting, the uncertainty, the not knowing if the final image would be one of beautiful, startling clarity or one of complete and utter ruin. I lived for his visits and dreaded them in equal measure. The comfort of his physical presence was a balm to a loneliness I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Having him there, filling my quiet apartment with his easy laughter and his tired sighs, felt like coming home. But the ambiguity was a slow-acting poison. My internal monologue was a relentless cycle of analysis and second-guessing. He laid his hand on my knee for a full 5 seconds. What does that mean? He fell asleep with his arm draped across my stomach. Was he really asleep? He looked at me for just a moment too long when he said goodbye. Did I imagine that? I was losing myself in the labyrinth of his unspoken needs, my own needs buried so deep I could barely remember what they were. One Saturday, we drove up into the mountains. The aspens were at their peak, a riot of gold against the deep blue of the Colorado sky. We hiked for hours, the air crisp and clean, our conversation easy and meandering. He seemed more relaxed than I had ever seen him. He was talking about maybe leaving his job, about wanting something more tangible, more real. He wasn't just complaining. He was problem-solving, thinking aloud. He asked me about my work, about the technical aspects of my cameras, his curiosity genuine and deep. For a few hours, the tension that hummed between us in the confines of my apartment seemed to dissipate in the vastness of the landscape. We were just two friends, breathing the same mountain air. That night, back at my apartment, the familiar ritual began. We were on the couch, a documentary about deep-sea exploration playing on the television. He was stretched out, his head in my lap. I had grown accustomed to the weight of it, to the feel of his hair beneath my fingers, a habit I had developed without even realizing it. Stroking his hair gently as he slept, it was a line I had crossed without a conscious decision, a slow erosion of my own boundaries. The narrator of the documentary was talking about the immense pressure of the deep ocean, about the strange and beautiful creatures that thrived in the crushing dark. I felt a kinship with them. I too was living under an immense, unspoken pressure, adapting into a strange new version of myself. I looked down at him. His eyes were closed, his breathing even. The faint blue light of the television flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the soft curve of his lips. A wave of affection, so powerful it was physically painful, washed over me. It was a love that was both old and new, the familiar ache of my college years compounded by the intense, confusing intimacy of the past few months. In that moment, the ambiguity was simply too much to bear. The careful architecture of my self-control, so meticulously maintained for so long, began to crack. I wanted to lean down. I wanted to close the small distance between our faces. I wanted to know, but I didn't. The fear was a cold hand on my heart. The fear of being wrong. The fear of shattering the fragile, beautiful, terrifying thing we were building. The fear of seeing confusion, or worse, pity, in his eyes. To risk the friendship for a feeling that might be nothing more than my own projected fantasy. It was a gamble I still wasn't brave enough to take. So I stayed still, my hand resting in his hair, and watched the strange, luminous fish swim through the darkness on the screen. I was in the deep ocean with them, waiting for the pressure to either crush me or transform me completely. The waiting was the hardest part. The crossing did not happen with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. It was his 5th or 6th visit, a late autumn weekend when the first hints of winter were in the air. The ritual had become so ingrained it felt like a law of nature. Friday night, exhaustion. Saturday, a slow return to himself. Saturday night, the couch, the movie, the slow drift into physical contact. But this night was different. The silence in the room felt heavier, more deliberate. The air itself seemed to hum with a low-frequency tension. He was in his usual position, head in my lap, but he wasn't feigning sleep. I knew because the subtle tension in his body was gone, replaced by a stillness that was alert and watchful. I could feel him breathing, a slow, conscious rhythm that was not the rhythm of sleep. My own body was a string pulled taut. I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen, but I wasn't seeing it. My entire consciousness was focused on the man in my lap, on the unspoken thing that was spooling out between us and the darkness. My hand, which had been resting on his chest, felt impossibly heavy. I wanted to move it, but I was paralyzed. I was no longer in the darkroom, patiently waiting for an image to develop. I was in the camera itself, the shutter locked open, the film exposed to the light for far too long. The image was about to be burned, bleached into nothingness. He shifted, just slightly, tilting his head to look up at me. My gaze was drawn downward, as if by a physical force. In the flickering blue light from the screen, his eyes were dark pools of something I couldn't decipher. Fear? Longing? A question? He didn't smile. His expression was one of profound, heartbreaking seriousness. We just looked at each other for a long moment that stretched into an eternity. The sounds from the television, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren. It all faded away into a dull, distant roar. The world had contracted to the space between our faces. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild animal trying to escape its cage. This was it, the moment of truth, the precipice I had been standing on for months. I could feel the ground crumbling beneath my feet. He didn't break eye contact. His gaze held mine, steady and unwavering. It felt like he was seeing me, truly seeing me, for the first time. Not as his friend, not as his roommate, not as his safe harbor, but as me, Leo. Then, his voice, barely a whisper, cutting through the silence. Leo. It was not a question. It was a statement. My name, on his lips, sounded like a prayer or a confession. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He swallowed, a small, audible sound in the quiet room. His eyes searched mine, and in them I saw it. The same terror that was gripping me. And beneath it, the same unbearable, undeniable hope. He was just as scared as I was. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't the unknowing initiator. He was just as lost in this as I was. We were two people who had stumbled into this strange, beautiful, terrifying room together, and neither of us knew where the door was. He slowly, tentatively, raised a hand, his fingers brushing against my jaw. His touch was feather-light, hesitant. It was a question. My entire body shuddered at the contact. I didn't pull away. I leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch, a silent answer. Yes. His eyes fluttered closed for a second, a brief surrender. Then he opened them again. Would it be? He started, his voice thick with emotion, and he couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew what he was asking. He was asking for permission to detonate the bomb we had both been so carefully guarding. He was asking if it was okay to shatter everything. I closed my eyes, a mirror of his own surrender. I gave another small nod. It was more than a yes. It was a plea. Please. He pushed himself up slowly, moving from my lap to sit beside me on the couch. The space he had occupied felt cold now, a sudden absence. He turned to face me, our knees knocking together. He lifted both hands, cupping my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. His hands were shaking. Or maybe I was. I couldn't tell. I opened my eyes and he was right there, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a man on the verge of either a breakdown or a revelation. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not hungry or demanding. It was the softest, most tentative kiss I had ever known. It was a question mark put to my lips. It was hesitant and trembling and profoundly gentle. It was the taste of salt and uncertainty. It was the culmination of years of unspoken affection and months of agonizing ambiguity. It was a confession, a surrender, and a beginning, all in one breathtaking, terrifying moment. I responded with equal gentleness, a quiet meeting of pressure, a silent acknowledgement. Yes, this. Finally. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but in that small eternity, the entire architecture of my world was demolished and rebuilt. The locked room inside me burst open, not with a violent explosion, but with a quiet, flooding light. When he pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes still closed. We just breathed. The same air, the same rhythm. The deep sea pressure was gone, replaced by a stillness that was not empty, but full. It was the stillness of arrival. The aftermath was not the peaceful dawn I had foolishly imagined. It was a gray, disorienting morning shrouded in a thick fog of confusion. I woke up in my own bed, alone. For a disoriented moment, I thought I might have dreamed the entire thing. The look in his eyes, the whisper of my name, the impossible softness of his lips. But the indentation of his head was still on the pillow next to mine. Sometime in the night, after the kiss, after we had sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, after he had finally whispered, "I'm so tired," we had migrated to my bed. Not out of passion, but out of a shared, unspoken need not to be alone. We had slept on opposite sides of the mattress, a chaste, yawning canyon between us, but we were in the same room, under the same roof, and that had felt like enough. But now he was gone. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, clawed its way up my throat. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. His duffel bag was gone from its spot by the door. The sweatshirt was gone from the armchair. The only evidence of his presence was a single coffee mug, rinsed and sitting in the drying rack by the sink. On the kitchen counter was a hastily scrawled note on a napkin. Had to catch an early flight. Something came up. Talk soon. Jay talks soon. The two most hollow words in the English language. I sank onto the couch, the very couch that had been our stage, and felt the silence of my apartment press in on me. It was no longer a peaceful quiet. It was a loud, roaring absence. The fog of confusion began to burn away, leaving behind the sharp, ugly sting of reality. I had misinterpreted everything. The kiss hadn't been a confession. It had been a mistake. A moment of lonely, drunken, post-breakup confusion on his part. I had been a port in a storm, a convenient body, a temporary fix for a loneliness he couldn't face. And now, in the clear light of day, he had fled, horrified by his own lapse in judgment. The pain was a physical thing, a dull, heavy ache in my chest. It was the pain of humiliation, of having my deepest, most secret hopes held up to the light and revealed as nothing more than pathetic, wishful thinking. The beautiful, luminous image I thought was developing had been exposed to the harsh light of morning and was now just a black, ruined sheet of paper. I had been a fool. I had let him dismantle my defenses. I had let him into the most guarded spaces of my heart, and he had simply walked away, leaving the door wide open behind him. The rage came next, a hot, bitter wave. Rage at him for his carelessness, for his casual cruelty, but mostly rage at myself, for being so naive, for wanting it so badly that I had ignored all the warning signs, for believing, even for a second, that the sun would choose to orbit the moon. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The talk soon never came. My phone remained silent. Each passing hour was a fresh confirmation of my worst fears. I replayed the kiss, the entire weekend, the past few months, over and over in my head, a torturous film loop. I searched for the moment I got it wrong, the sign I missed. Had I imagined the vulnerability in his eyes? Had I projected the meaning onto his touch? The ambiguity that had once been a source of thrilling tension was now a source of pure torment. I was adrift in a sea of my own making, with no land in sight. I tried to work. I went into my darkroom, the familiar scent of chemicals a small comfort. But I couldn't focus. The quiet of the room felt accusatory. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I tried to handle the negatives. I felt like a fraud. How could I presume to capture the truth of a landscape, the essence of a person, when I couldn't even read the truth of what was right in front of me? My own life was a blurry, out-of-focus mess. After a week of this self-inflicted torture, the pain and humiliation began to curdle into something else. A hard, cold resolve. I could not live in this limbo. I could not let him ghost me after what had happened. It wasn't about demanding a relationship or forcing a confession of love. It was about demanding the basic human decency of an explanation. It was about my own self-respect. I deserved more than a note on a napkin. The friendship we had, the years of history, deserved more. Even if the answer was what I feared, that it was all a mistake, I needed to hear it. I needed the finality. I needed to be able to close the door he had left hanging open. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name in my contacts list. My heart hammered against my ribs, a familiar, sickening rhythm. This was a different kind of precipice. The first had been about the fear of a beginning. This was about the fear of a definitive end. But I knew I had to jump. I couldn't stay here, frozen in uncertainty. I took a deep breath and hit the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up, my courage failing, when he answered. Hey, his voice was flat, guarded. A stranger's voice. Hey, I said, my own voice tight. I had planned what to say, a calm, rational speech. But the sound of his voice, so distant and cold, shattered my composure. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. What the hell, Julian? What the hell was that? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of traffic, the anonymous noise of his city. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, strained. Leo, I can't do this right now. You can't do this right now. My voice rose, edged with a hysterical disbelief I couldn't control. You kiss me, you sleep in my bed, and then you disappear with a note on a napkin, and you can't do this right now? When, exactly, were you planning on doing this? Or was the plan just to never speak to me again? Was I supposed to just pretend it never happened? It's not like that, he said, but his words lacked any conviction. He sounded exhausted, defeated. Then what is it like, Julian? I demanded, pacing my small living room like a caged animal. Tell me, please. Just be honest with me. If it was a mistake, just say it. If you were drunk or lonely or whatever, just tell me. I can take it. What I can't take is this. This silence. This disrespect. Don't treat me like I'm nothing. We were friends. The last word came out broken. He was quiet for so long I thought he had hung up. I was about to speak again when I heard him take a shaky breath. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of all its defenses. It was the voice of the man from the wedding, the man adrift and lost. It was a whisper. I'm scared. The two words stopped me in my tracks. Of all the things I had expected him to say, that was not one of them. My anger, so hot and righteous just a moment before, evaporated, leaving me feeling hollow and unsteady. Scared of what? I asked, my voice softer now. Of this, he said, his voice cracking. Of what it means. What I felt. Leo, I've spent my whole life on a track. A straight line. College, swim team, girlfriend, good job, next girlfriend. It was all laid out. I knew who I was supposed to be. And then, I don't know. The last year, it's all felt wrong. Like I'm suffocating. And being with you, it's the only time I've felt like I could breathe. But it doesn't make any sense. He was rambling now, the words spilling out in a torrent of confused confession. That night, it wasn't a mistake. God, it was the most real thing I've felt in, maybe ever. And that's what's so terrifying. Waking up the next morning, it was like the whole world had tilted on its axis. Nothing looked the same. And I looked at you, sleeping there, and all I could think was that I was going to ruin you. That I was going to pull you into my own mess. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. I don't know who I am right now. And I ran. I ran because I was scared of what I wanted. And I was scared of hurting you. And I ended up doing it anyway. I sank down onto my couch, the phone pressed hard against my ear. I was listening to the sound of a man dismantling his own identity, piece by piece. The carefully constructed facade of Julian, the golden boy, the confident athlete, was crumbling, and in its place was someone raw and terrified and honest. The hurt and humiliation I had been nursing for a week dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so profound it almost brought me to my tears. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. Julian, I said, my voice steady now clear. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to know who you are. God knows I don't. I took a breath. But you can't run. Not from me. We can be scared together. A sound came from the other end of the line, a choked sob that he tried and failed to suppress. And in that broken, vulnerable sound, I heard everything. The loneliness, the confusion, the fear, and the hope. It was all there. I'm sorry, he whispered. Leo, I'm so sorry. I know, I said. Come back to Denver. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a statement of fact, a direction, a lighthouse in his fog. There was a pause. And then his voice, small but clear. Okay. The resolution did not arrive with a flash of insight or a grand romantic declaration. It arrived on my doorstep 2 days later in the form of Julian, looking pale and sleep-deprived, holding his duffel bag in one hand and a fragile, tentative hope in the other. When I opened the door, we just stood there for a moment, the silence of the hallway a stark contrast to the storm of our last conversation. He looked smaller than I remembered, less like the sun and more like a man who had been weathered by a long and difficult journey. Hi, he said, his voice quiet. Hi, I replied. I stepped aside and let him in. He dropped his bag by the door, in its familiar spot, and the simple act felt like a promise. He didn't retreat to the armchair. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking at me, his hands shoved into his pockets. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said, with the weight of his fear and my hurt. I don't know where to start, he said, his gaze fixed on the floor. How about we sit down? I suggested, gesturing to the couch. Our couch. The scene of the crime, the site of the revelation. He nodded and we sat, leaving a careful, deliberate space between us. It was a different kind of distance now. It wasn't about boundaries or denial. It was about respect, about giving each other room to breathe. We talked for hours. Or rather, he talked, and I listened. He unspooled the tangled knot of his life, the pressure from his family, the expectations he had always tried to meet, the growing sense of dislocation from his own life. He talked about his relationships with women, how he had always felt like he was playing a part, saying the right lines, making the right moves, but feeling a profound emotional disconnect. He talked about our friendship in college, how my quiet, observant presence had always felt like a steadying anchor in his chaotic world, a place where he didn't have to perform. I think, he said, his voice barely audible, I think I might have been in love with you even then. I just didn't have the language for it. It didn't fit into the story I was telling myself about my life. so I buried it. So deep I convinced myself it wasn't there, he finally looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. And then at the wedding, seeing you again, it was like all those years of burying it were for nothing. It all came back. And when I was here, it was the only place I felt like myself. The real me. Not the consultant, not the swim captain. Just Julian. And that person, the real Julian, is in love with you. And it scares the hell out of me. There it was. The truth, laid bare between us. It was not a triumphant declaration. It was a terrified confession, offered up with trembling hands. My own carefully guarded heart, the one that had been bruised and battered by the week of silence, cracked open, not with pain, but with a feeling of overwhelming tenderness. All those years of my secret, one-sided affection, it hadn't been one-sided at all. We had been living in two separate, locked rooms, each holding a key to the other's door, too afraid to see if it would fit. I reached across the space between us and took his hand. His fingers were cold. He flinched at my touch, then relaxed, his fingers curling around mine. It scares me too, I admitted, my voice thick. I've been in love with you since we were 20 years old, Julian. I just got better at hiding it. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek. He let out a shaky laugh that was half a sob. God, he whispered. All that time we wasted, it wasn't wasted, I said, squeezing his hand. It just took us a while to get here. We had to get lost before we could find the way that night. There were no rituals. There was no plausible deniability. After we had talked ourselves into exhaustion, after the confessions and tears had given way to a quiet, fragile peace, I stood up. Come on, I said, holding out my hand to him. He took it without hesitation, and I led him to my bedroom. We got into bed, and this time there was no chasm between us. He turned onto his side to face me, and I mirrored him. In the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the window, I could see the exhaustion and the relief warring on his face. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair off my forehead, his touch as gentle and tentative as his first kiss had been. Is this okay? He whispered. It's more than okay, I said. It's everything. He moved closer, closing the last few inches between us, and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him, my arms circling his back, and felt the tension finally, completely, drain out of his body. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of profound release. He was not seeking comfort out of loneliness or confusion anymore. He was seeking a home. And in the solid, warm weight of him in my arms, in the steady beat of his heart against my own, I realized I had found mine too. He fell asleep like that, tangled up with me. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I slept soundly, without fear, without questions. In the weeks and months that followed, we began the slow, deliberate process of building a new kind of architecture. We were not just friends, and we were not quite lovers in the conventional sense. We were two people learning a new language together, word by word, gesture by gesture. He went back to Chicago, but only to quit his job and pack up his life. The decision, which had seemed so monumental and terrifying to him before, now felt simple, obvious. He moved into my apartment, not as a guest on my couch, but as a partner. There were difficult conversations. There were moments of fear and uncertainty, old habits of self-protection dying hard. He had to navigate the process of coming out to his family, a journey I could only support from the sidelines. I had to learn to trust this new reality, to dismantle the fortress I had built around my heart, and accept that this love was real and it was mine to keep. We learned to communicate not just in the comfortable silences, but with words. We learned to say, I'm scared, and I need you, and I love you. The couch ritual was replaced by a new normal. Now, when we sat together, his head in my lap, it was not a prelude to an ambiguous sleep. It was just an evening. My hand in his hair was not a secret transgression, but a simple, open gesture of affection. The physical space between us was no longer a minefield of interpretation, but a playground of easy intimacy. We built a life in the small moments, making coffee together in the morning, arguing about what to watch on television, the quiet companionship of reading side by side in bed. It was a life built not on grand romance, but on the profound, steady peace of domesticity. One afternoon, I was in my darkroom, developing the photos I had taken at Mark and Sarah's wedding. I came across a shot I had taken of Julian. It was from that first night, when we were catching up by the bar. He was listening to me talk, and I had captured him in a moment of unguarded attentiveness. His expression was soft, his gaze focused entirely on me. Looking at it now, with the knowledge of everything that had happened since, I could see it so clearly. The longing, the affection, the years of buried feelings, all there in the subtle set of his mouth, in the light in his eyes. It had been there all along. I just hadn't known how to see it. The image bloomed in the chemical bath, sharp and clear and perfect. There was no ruin. There was only the beautiful, honest truth, finally brought into the light. We learn, eventually, that the most important spaces in our lives are not defined by walls and ceilings, but by the quality of the silence they contain. They are built from shared vulnerability and the quiet trust that you can be your whole self, unguarded and unadorned, and still be seen. Julian and I had spent years in separate rooms, deafened by the noise of our own fears and expectations. But in the aftermath of a wedding, in the sterile quiet of a hotel room, and the borrowed intimacy of my living room, we stumbled our way toward a different kind of space. It was a space built of hesitant touches and whispered confessions, of terrifying honesty and the profound relief of being truly known. We didn't fall in love. We excavated a love that had been there all along, buried under years of silence. And in the beautiful, peaceful quiet we finally learned to create together, we found our way home.